All right, let's see. We're reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. You can follow along on the screen or on your hard copy. It doesn't matter which way you do it. And you're doing the questions as we go along. The first thing we're looking for is you're going to analyze the character of Nick Carraway. You're also going to try to figure out why Nick is used as the narrator. All right, but we'll come back to those questions as we go along here. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. Apparently, the father realizes that Nick was raised rich, and not all people get the opportunity to be raised rich. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. It's funny, he says that he reserves all judgments, and yet he then says these abnormal minds talk to him. He's a normal person, and they're all abnormal, and they're all boors, and they're all wild, unknown men. So he must think of himself as normal. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something that if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decency is parceled out unequally at birth. So he says he reserves judgments, and yet he says that the rich people are given fundamental decencies and the poor people aren't. So it seems kind of ironic. He says he's not judgmental, and then yet he judges it all over the place. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Comet conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gadsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gadsby, who represented everything for which I had an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift of hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gadsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gadsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So he's complaining at the same time that he's saying that he likes Gadsby. He complains that when he went east to New York City, he went back to the West and wanted the world to be in uniform at sort of moral attention. He didn't like what he saw in New York City. He didn't want the riotous excursions anymore. But there was something about Gatsby that he liked, something gorgeous about him, something about his sensitivity to the promises of life, something about his gift of hope Something about his romantic readiness that he liked Gadsby. Gadsby turned out all right in the end. Okay, now he talks about his family back in the West. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual foundation of my line was my grandfather's brother who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. Okay, so were rich enough that they could hire someone to go to the war for them, and they stayed home and established a business that made them more money. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him with special reference to that rather hard boiled painting that hangs in father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raids so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. Okay, so it's 1922. He had gone to Yale and graduated in 1915. That's after being in the Great War, World War I. America thought it was the last war that they would fight. And when they came back from World War I, that's when the stock market went crazy. And he said everyone he knows is in the bond business. So he goes to New York and starts to work on Wall Street in the spring of 1922, roaring 20s. America in that time in the Northeast, in New York, they were thinking everything was great and was going to be great forever. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at 80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge, which is a type of car, and a Finnish woman, that's a woman from Finland, who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. So apparently he went out and got himself a house to rent. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. And I told him. And as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. So he moves out to Long Island, and now he's happy as if everything's going to start all over again. He moved from the West to New York, and he thinks everything's going to be great. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. And this is actually important because the book is going to be looked at from a single perspective. Nick, from his rich white guy from the Midwest, He's going to look at the entire story from his single perspective. Life is easier to see from a single perspective. It's hard to see things from multiple perspectives at the same time. The entire time, the perspective is from Nick's perspective. The entire story is told from Nick's perspective as the narrator. And he's a rich white guy from the Midwest. And so he won't see things the same thing way a woman might see things, or the same thing way a poor person might see things, or the same way as a minority might see things, or the same way as someone who's not been educated, had a chance to go to college. So he's going to see things from his perspective. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great, wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They're not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So he moves out to Long Island, and there's two peninsulas that stick out into the Sound. He lives on one of them, West Egg, and there's another one that's going to be called East Egg, and they look the same, but they're not the same. One's going to be a wealthy community, and the other one's not quite as much. I lived at West Egg, the, well, less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gadsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gadsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore. It was a dump. But it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and a consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. So he moves, he rents a house right next door to the rich people, including Gatsby. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. Okay, so apparently he lives on one side, and if you look across the bay, the other side is even richer. And the history of the summer really begins with the evening that I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I'd spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy, even in college. His freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Okay, so here we go. Daisy, his cousin, married Tom Buchanan. Tom Buchanan played football at Yale and went to school with Nick. Tom Buchanan apparently has so much money, he even has polo ponies. That's that game you play, riding horses. It's kind of like soccer with a mallet. You ride around whacking the ball, and you have to be enormously wealthy to own polo ponies, because they cost a ton of money to maintain. And of course, then you have to be like playing with other rich people. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then they drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens, and finally, when it reached the house, drifting up its side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Okay, so here we are. Nick is riding over to meet a college friend. He's going over to his house. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swang of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So, our first description of Tom Buchanan, we get all these negative words: hard, supercilious, arrogant, aggressively, power, cruel. And it continues. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked. And there were men in New Haven who had hated his guts. "Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final," he seemed to say, "just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are." We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. "It belonged to Domain, the oil man." He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as the wind does on the sea. Okay, so we've arrived at Tom's house. We walk inside, and the author decides to describe it in this imaginative way, as if the wind is blowing through the house and blowing the curtains like waves on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up, as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. And then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the caught wind died about the room, and the curtains and the rugs, and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. Okay, so there's two women sitting on this couch, and the younger one, he doesn't know who she is. The other one is his cousin. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression, and then she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh. Ha ha ha! And I laughed too, and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. Ha ha! She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. So the other girl's last name was Baker. Turns out her name is Jordan Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. So apparently, Jordan Baker seems totally self-sufficient. She can take care of herself, which maybe in the 1920s, early 1920s, that was kind of surprising, maybe, for a man to think that a woman was self-sufficient. Women had been just recently given the right to vote. Uh, Women still took men's names and became Mrs. So and so. So maybe back then, it was quite stunning to find someone who was self sufficient. I look back at my cousin who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget, a shining compulsion, a whispered, listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the horizon. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. Oh, the whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night long along the northern shore. Oh, how gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. And then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's. Okay, so what happened here? They left Chicago, and Nick makes this joke that all the cars have painted their tires black because they're all missing Daisy. And it's a reference to cars that weren't around before this time period. People now had the opportunity to hop in a car and drive somewhere where they used to have to get on a horse or ride a carriage. People now can live in the city and drive around in cars. The economy is pretty good, so a lot of people can afford to buy cars. A lot of people have moved to the city because they've moved from the farms to the factories in the cities. So a lot has changed in America at this time. Okay, let's see, where do we go? Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What have you been doing, Nick? I'm a bondman. Who is? I told him. Ah, never heard of him, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly, if you will stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came in the room. Evidently, it surprised her just as much as it did me, for she yawned, and with a series of rapid, deft movements, she stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. So she says no to the drinks because she's in training. So maybe she's athlete? Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was that she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the soldiers like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. Nick likes looking at Miss Baker, and then there's a description of her that describes her as skinny, looking like a young soldier with gray eyes. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gadsby. Gadsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gadsby? And before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Dinner is served. Now, rich people back then could afford to have all kinds of people in their house. So somebody came in and said, dinner's on the table. They just have to walk into the other room and eat it. Somebody else serve them and hand them forks and stuff like that. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rose-colored porch, open towards the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us all radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an awed expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a— I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, and that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. That's wine. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by its tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Well, we just found out something about Tom. He's reading this book, Rise of the Colored Empires, and he's saying you got to watch out for the white race, right? He's a racist. So Daisy reacts by saying, Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word we— Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatient. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously towards the fervent sun. Is Daisy making fun of him here, or is she agreeing with him? We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously towards the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. Now, why would Miss Baker talk about California? California, especially in the 1920s, was way more diverse. than New York. There was a lot of Spanish influence. There was a lot of Asian influence. There's a lot going on in California. And Miss Baker, I guess, maybe she thinks it's okay. Maybe she's not a racist like Tom. The idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and you are, and. After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we produced all the things that go into make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency were more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned towards me. Bring! We're going to stop here with the interruption of the telephone. We're going to make sure that you guys understand the questions. We have Nick Carraway being described. He's from the West. He's wealthy. He's white. The fact that he's from the West makes him a little more conservative, apparently. He doesn't like something about the New York life. He wants to go home and he wants the world to be at moral attention. The author uses Nick as the narrator instead of using Gatsby or any other character. Nick will have a perspective on everything. That perspective is important to the author. The author uses that single window, that single perspective to tell the story. Number 3, in terms of setting time and place, we're talking 1920s in New York City. Very interesting what has happened in 1920s. World War I is over, and America thinks it's the last war they ever have to fight. Women have gotten the vote. Women are starting to feel some enthusiasm for freedom. Women dress differently with dresses that are shorter. They show more skin. They're out partying and dancing and enjoying themselves. Prohibition is happening. And so, although liquor is illegal, there's plenty of opportunity to get it in the illegal bars all over New York City. There's money all over the place because of the stock market. Stock market is booming, and in the 1920s they called it the Roaring Twenties because it seems like life was great and it was going to be great forever. Number 4, Jay Gatsby. We've sort of met him. He was described as, gorgeous. He had infinite hope, promise. Um, he turns out all right in the end, even though everybody else is running around partying. Somehow the narrator thinks Gatsby's all right in the end. There's a reference to the automobile. Nick says that they all had their cars painted as a mourning wreath because Daisy has left town and they're all so sad. But really, the automobile changed everything, changed lifestyles. The invention of the automobile helped people get to the city, helped people leave the farms, helped people get around and go to places and visit people and intermingle where they couldn't do that as easily before with just horses. Tom Buchanan, the character of Tom Buchanan, we meet him in the beginning. He just seems like a pretty strong athlete, bully kind of guy. And then eventually we see him as a racist. And then the telephone rings. That's where we left off. There's a little bit more about Tom we're going to get in a minute, but that's for another day.